All right, so here's xLights, our web page. Now, if you haven't downloaded xLights, obviously you go to the download page and you download xLights. If you're using it on OS X, you'll need to go to the App Store to download the OS X version, but I use the Windows version, and to access that you download it here via this link. Now when you download it, you will often get warnings either from your virus scanning software or from Windows itself that this is, you know, not commonly downloaded and suspicious and everything else. And because we release the software so frequently, this is effectively an ongoing problem. And so you will need to, you know, give your operating system permission to install the software. Now, I've already installed the software. I'm not going to go through that. That's pretty basic, but it is now installed. So let's fire it up for the first time here. And I have set it up here such that this is like a fresh install. And the first thing that you will see when you start up xLights for the first time is it will pop up a dialog asking you to set a show folder. Here it comes, there it says, select a show directory, it says. So what is a show directory? Well, a show directory is the directory in which we are going to have our show folder. So all of the data that's associated with our show should sit within a show folder. And so you need to choose a folder or create a folder that you're going to want to do that. Now, typically you'd probably want to do that in your documents folder. In this case, I'm on my desktop. But you want to create a folder here and give it a name. Now, the only thing I can say about your show folder is do not put the date inside the name. You want the name to be quite generic, like show folder or home or Christmas or something like that. If you really want to keep things sorted and separated by years, by all means create a 2021 folder, right? But then go into that folder and create a new folder called Christmas, and make that your show folder. And the reason for that is as you start to move your show folder around, move it from computer to computer, which you may not do for 2 or 3 years when you eventually buy a new computer, etc. Having a folder that is generically named and not associated with the year will ensure that all of your links to your files and everything continue to work as expected. If I called this folder Christmas 2021 and next year I came in and renamed it to Christmas 2022, all of the links to videos and pictures and all those other sorts of things that I use within my sequences would all potentially break, and I would have to go through and fix them all up, which is a real pain in the backside. So you don't want to be doing that. If you stick with a folder like Christmas or the name of your show or something, you won't have those sorts of problems. So in this case, I'm just going to use this generic show folder here, and I select it, and up comes xLights. Now, xLights at this point is really, the first thing it's going to do here is it's going to prompt you for your email address. You can or cannot provide it. It's up to you. All this does is include your email address in any log files that you might submit to us with crashes so that we can reach back out to you if we need any additional information about the crash. If you choose not to, that's fine. It just means that I won't know where the crash came from, and we won't be able to follow you up for any information. In a year of having that in place, I think we've emailed 3 people, and I actually don't think any of them responded. So so before we get in and start creating anything, let's quickly go to preferences, because there's a couple of preferences here that I really think you want to be changing when you start off. The first one is backup subfolders, and the reason I would suggest you want to select that is because if you start to store your sequences in any subfolders underneath the show folder, if you don't select this, then it will not back them up, which means you will lose them if something bad happens. So I would almost always select this unless you've got some other backup mechanism in place that will back them up for you. The second thing that I would do, I mean, all of these things are great, and you can go and use them, but the other ones that I would ensure that I do, this render on save I would turn off. outside of a brief period around your show time when you're actually going to be playing your show, to be honest, I find that this is a bigger pain than it is useful. I also generally turn model blending off as well because I don't want it if I can avoid it. The other one that I would do is I would come down the end here, and these two link items, I would set those to both the non-none options. And what this will do is this will just streamline some things which historically you've had to do two things, and this will allow you to just do one. They're the main options. The other options, to be honest, the view one can be useful if you're hard of seeing and you need bigger text, etc. You might want to play with some of these. I definitely I like my model handle size is large, and sometimes having the play controls on the preview can be useful and the like. But you can play with these or read up in the manual that Scott maintains to understand what all of these things do. So there's some of the things there. Let me quickly go now we haven't done anything, right? So we've got absolutely no controllers set up. Our layout tab is where we set up our show layout, and there's nothing here. And the sequencer, of course, we haven't got a sequence open, so everything's blank here. But even before we go into that, I'm going to go and quickly create an empty sequence. Just click done, because there's a couple other things that I do want to do here. So one is, and this will be set by default, is you want to make sure that these resets when changing effects checkboxes. There's one here, and there's one here. You want to make sure that they are all selected, because you will find that makes your sequencing a little bit easier. I could go into why and how it works, etc., but just take it from me. You probably want these things selected. It'll make things easier. The other thing, and actually this is not going to work, I have to go back and let me discard that. Let me create a musical sequence. I have some royalty-free audio here that I can play if necessary. And one of the things that I want to do is I want to come in here and do an add timing track, because I can actually choose this download the Queen Mary Vamp plugins for audio analysis. Now you want to be doing this. This is these plugins, as the title suggests, are actually created by an organisation or a university in the UK called the Queen Mary University. And what these plugins do is they analyse the audio and work out timing marks. They're commonly used in a program called Audacity, which is an audio editing software that's also open source. But we also use these plugins to provide you with a number of features. So I suggest you go there, click OK. It will launch your browser, and it will download the install for your particular version of xLights. If you click on that, it prompted me for administrative privileges, and then we just quickly go through and we install it. It only takes a second or two. Now the other thing that I will need to do at this point is I will need to shut down xLights. We don't need to save anything yet. And when I start up xLights again, that means that all the Audacity plugins will be available. And you definitely want to be doing that so that you can do things like beat detection and bar detection and note onset detection and the like, which will definitely simplify your sequencing later. You can install that at any time. You don't have to do it right at the beginning. If you had xLights installed for a month or two, you can still go there and install that. Now you will need to have a sequence with audio, otherwise that option doesn't appear, which is why I had to go back and recreate that sequence with audio. Okay, so now we're all set up and ready to go. The first thing you're going to want to do is do your layout. Now the layout screen here, this black area here is where I'm going to set up my show. This section of the screen here will have a list of the models that I've created in my show, and down here will be the properties of the various elements. And when you click on the background here, you get these generic properties around the whole layout. And the first one here is the background image. And here you're going to want to select a background image for your house. So you're going to want a picture of your house. Now, this is not the best picture of my house. I cropped it in my actual show, but that doesn't matter. Now you're going to want to play with the size of it here. So we're going to want to make this, I don't know, 18. Whoops, no, apparently I need to go down. 900. That's just playing with it a bit more. Maybe I can just choose fill. Yeah, I think fill actually just optimizes it. Now I probably actually want to go in and crop this picture a little bit just to make it a little bit better, and you can easily do that by opening up your house picture in your favorite editing software, and we click edit, and if I come in I can crop this down to include my house and my lights. It's a bit better. So now bring it up. Okay, so it's a little bit bigger. Now I always start with a picture of my house that has the lights up, and the reason I do that is because it makes it a lot easier for me to lay things out. Now I'm starting here at the moment with the layout in 2 dimensions, which means that this particular location where I took the photo from will be the optimal place to watch my show. Everything will be in the right place, and only at this particular point. Now, if you're doing 3D, obviously you have a lot more options, but for the most people, 2D is actually good enough for them to lay their show out. And I will come back and I'll do a quick layout in 3D as well, but let's start off here with 2D. So the first thing you want to do is you want to start laying out your models, and you do that using these buttons at the top here, which allow you to drop different props of different types onto your display. Now these are tri-state buttons. When you click them once, they go slightly grey, and you can come onto here and you can draw something, and once you've drawn it, it deselects, and if you click on the screen, nothing else happens. But if you click on these twice, it goes a very much lighter shade of grey, and if I come down here and draw, then I can effectively just keep drawing and drawing and drawing and drawing and drawing, and it will just keep on drawing arches forever until I click on the button again and turn it back to black. So now if you can go back in here and undo, and if you just press the Control-Z key, of course it will undo those things. Now the other thing is, if you noticed as I was drawing these arches, now let me delete that and start again. When I was drawing these arches, see how that red line occasionally appears? That red line appearing tells me that the arch is perfectly flat at that point. And so if I drop it, the arch bottom is perfectly flat. Now, you can come down in the properties. There is a set of things called size and location, and it actually allows you to manually edit these things if you really wanted to. But you can obviously click and drag them here. It's just that sometimes it can be quite hard, obviously, to get that red line to appear. It can be quite difficult. So that's your arches. That's your candy canes. Your candy canes is also useful for sticks, and I'll show you that in a minute. The channel block, very few people use, but the channel block can be a great way to represent dumb channels on a lighter arm or a Renard controller, etc. If you're much more used to sequencing at the channel level, the channel block model can be really useful for that. The circle model, useful for circles and some wreath types depending on the layout of your pixels. The cube model, for those people going 3D, this can also be really useful for pixel stakes. It doesn't look really good here in 2D, but if I was to go into 3D, you'd find that that's actually a 3D cube that's 5 by 5 by 5 pixels. And so that's more of a 3D prop. The custom prop looks incredibly boring because it just draws a blank square, but this allows me to go and define any prop I want with any layout of pixels that I want. The DMX one has a whole bunch of options. So this is where you would do things like your moving heads. It's also possible to do some of the floodlights, particularly the more than 3-channel floodlights. I wouldn't necessarily use these for 3-channel floodlights because they do come with some limitations, but you can. It's also useful for things like skulls and servo control and the like. And there's also a general one here that's great for things like smoke machines and bubble machines and the like as well, if you want to get into DMX props. The image prop actually lets you put an image in here, and I do use this in my display. I use this I have a blow up that I have lights in that I can turn on or off, and it's great for those sorts of things. You can also use it for things like single channel control of wireframes or even blow molds, etc. You could potentially use those. These things only have a single channel and they change in brightness according to the level. You have icicles. So this is the icicles prop for across your roof line. You have your matrix, which is also useful for pixel matrices, P10 panels, and also virtual matrices, which we won't spend a great deal of time on, but virtual matrices let you do things like sequence a TV or a projector or something like that. And so you'd use the matrix model. The single line model, which is great for things like house outlines and fence lines and things like that. The Polyline, which is even better for house outlines and fence lines and things like that, allows you to draw an arbitrary line. Now you will need to press the escape key. Always this question gets asked, how do I stop the Polyline? Well, you stop it by pressing the escape key, and at that point I can then move things around and edit things. The other thing that you can do that not everyone realizes is you can select a segment and you can actually define a curve on it. You do that by right-clicking there, and you can actually define curves as well. So the Polyline, I do my arch here on my house using the Polyline because of that ability to do that. So we'll come back to that. The other thing that you can do with the Polyline is you can also do icicles, and lines of sticks as well are also great with the Polyline. So you want to get familiar with that.
I have a question. When would it be appropriate for like a house outline to use the line versus the polyline?
So I would use a polyline if the line of pixels is all connected in one string, because it's reasonably easy to do. Whereas if you've got all the sections of your house outline are connected separately to the controller, I generally use a single line, or where it's all in a single line and it doesn't go off anywhere, there's obviously no point going with the polyline. But other than that, that's really the only reason.
Okay, when you're drawing the models like arches and everything, I see a lot of people posting saying that you have to go left to right, otherwise it doesn't render correctly. But I've never heard you or any other developer state that, so I was wondering if it was in fact true or if it was just a perception that people was having.
So there has been in the past issues with the start location and rendering. I don't believe that that's true. I'm happy to be shown otherwise, but I don't believe that's true. The sphere model, again, something that doesn't look great in 2D because it's a 3D prop, but this is actually a 3D sphere wired north-south that you can use to, and some people use this to represent 3D stars as well. While it doesn't look like a 3D star, it is quite an effective way to model it when it comes to sequencing. The spinner model. So the spinner model is used for spinners where you can control the number of arms. So that one's pretty straightforward. The star model is used for both single layered stars but also multiple layered stars, and we'll come back to that one. The tree model. So the tree model by default is a 3D pixel tree, but as you'll see in a minute, there's a bunch of properties that allow you to do 2D pixel trees and also spiral trees as well. So we'll come back to that one and talk about some of those things. Window outlines. Window outlines are great for both windows and doors. The top and the bottom are actually optional. You can have 0 pixels across the top or the bottom, so you can use it for a door outline as well. It does make an assumption that the left and right has the same number of pixels. So some people will use the window frame model, whereas some other people will use the Polyline model. It's 6 of one, half dozen of another. It does generate some different buffers, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, and I'll point you to a video where you can go and watch it and understand why they're different. Then there's the wreath model. The wreath model looks exactly like the circle model, except it's wired differently, and so understanding which is more appropriate to your circumstance is also key to decide which one you want to choose. Then there's these 2 icons at the end, and they're kind of related in that these work with what are known as X model files, which are files that contain a model that someone has shared. Now, most people will skip the import because they won't have one of these files locally. You would have to have an X model file on your machine that you'd got from somewhere to use the import. But everyone has available the download. And so if you click on the download button, nothing happens. You can sit here and wait and wait and wait, and nothing will happen. Just like the custom model, you actually have to draw the model onto the screen. And when you release the button, it goes off and accesses the internet and downloads a list of models. Now, if I collapse this list up, it actually has several libraries. It's got the Boscoyo Studios library, the Gilbert Engineering library, and there's actually a DMX fixture library, which is a whole bunch of DMX type models, like moving heads and the like, where we've sort of predefined what those things would look like. But the vast majority of people are going to download the models from either Boscoyo or Gilbert Engineering. And you can use this in one of 2 ways. You can have already decided on a particular model from a particular vendor, or you can be shopping for a model of a particular type. And one of the things you can do down here is you can say, well, actually, I'm interested in a snowman model. And if you type that in and click search, it will go through, and each time you click search, it will show you a different snowman from potentially a different vendor or the same vendor. These ones here, we're now in the Gilbert Engineering ones. All right. And this one, this is the DMX model library. So we're now in the xLights folder. So you can quickly go and find one of these models that you might have bought. And so you can take something like this. Now, these models are generally custom models. They're not exclusively custom models, but most of them are custom models. And often they will come with inbuilt face definitions and submodels, and we'll touch on those a little bit later. And so accessing them here rather than building them yourself obviously is a massive time saver. But you will need to wire the prop up the way the vendor has indicated the prop should be wired up. And so once you've chosen something that you want to insert, you just click on the insert model here, and it brings the model into your show like so. And you can add it to your show that way. Now, I can also take a model such as this model here, and if I right click on the model, I can also export the model. And so I'm going to export it into my show folder, and that will actually create one of those X model files I was talking about. And then I can click on this import, which, just like the download, does nothing when I just click it, but once I click and drag out, it pops up and asks me for the X model file, and I can now grab that X model file. And now I've got a second version of that tree that's been brought in. So that's a quick run through of all the model types. Now, you should, with all of these things, be able to represent any and all props that you might want to represent. Now, sometimes you can't make the prop look perfectly like the prop in real life, and sometimes that matters and sometimes it doesn't. Some people will religiously lay their props out exactly where they are on their display. Other people use a very stylized layout where they just put things onto the screen and they group them more according to how they like to think about them, and they don't worry so much about where they are on the screen. The reason why you might want to put it where they are on the screen is because one of the next things that you can do is you can start to take props. So if I hold the control key down and select these two singing faces, I can right click on this and create a group, and I can create a singing faces group. Well, if I could type, it would be and I don't have to call it a group, but sometimes it's easier if you do. And now I've got a group that contains multiple props, which I can also take advantage of when I'm sequencing. And so many people will go and create themselves a all house group. And so they will just click and drag and then create a group and say, yeah, we'll call that whole house. Now, with these groups, the actual location of the pixel on this screen actually makes a difference. So if I was to do an effect that was sweeping across all the models from left to right, and I was to put it on the whole house, then it will start on the left here and light up these pixels over here first, and then move progressively across the screen. And so if you want to take advantage of those whole house type effects or effects on groups, then you are almost certainly going to want to lay your models out where they are on your house, so that when you do that sweep across, it actually looks like a sweep across your house rather than just a random sweep across different props within your house layout. So that's why you might care about that. Okay, so let's go back, and I'm going to delete all of these. And let's go and add some things in, and let's deal with some of the more common props and some of the properties that we might want to set on them. So let's start with a tree, because this is, I think, from the survey I ran the other day, like the second or third most common thing that people have in their display is a tree. So there's actually 3 or 4 key tree types that you might want to deal with. Let's just add a bunch of trees. The first one, and probably the most common, is the 360-degree tree. This is a tree where there's a bunch of strands that go around the tree. The starting point for a tree like this is always assumed to be at the back. And this is really important. If you build your tree with the starting point on the side or on the front, you are going to have lots of difficulty in xLights with sequencing and the like, because you've built the tree differently to the way that xLights thinks that it's going to be built. And so I do strongly encourage that you pay attention to what xLights is doing here and build the props accordingly. If you go and build all your props and then you come into xLights, you will occasionally run into these complexities where you can't actually use the inbuilt tree prop to model your tree because you've done something weird that xLights doesn't support. So please, please, please model it in xLights first and then build it on your display. So let's go through some of the properties down here that matter. So the type here is important. This is a round tree. Let's leave these first two as round. This one here, let's change this to a flat tree. So a flat tree is typically a set of ribbons, but it doesn't have to be, where everything is laid flat against the wall. This is actually my tree, is a flat tree. Everything is flat. There's no 3D-ness to my tree at all. The other tree is a spiral tree, and we'll come back to that one in a minute. So with our tree here, we've got a number of degrees. So this is a 360-degree tree, and we'll leave that one as a 360. But let's change this one to a 180. And so you can see here that there is now no strings at the back of the tree. The tree starts here on the left and it ends here on the right. And this is also quite common, particularly where people have a tree up against a fixture or where the tree is only visible from the front of the house. And so there's really no reason to waste a bunch of pixels on the back of the tree when people can't really see them. And particularly if you're using things like the ABS type strips to push the pixels through, those things will effectively hide all of the lights from the back of the tree, and so you don't really need them. And so building a a 180 or potentially a 270 tree can be a really effective way of managing that. And so these trees here, for instance, are all modeled and built as 270-degree trees, because while you can walk around the front and you can see them from quite a distance, you can't actually ever see the back. And so there's no point having pixels on the back of those trees. It adds no value.
How do you get to know where each of these trees are starting?
There's a couple of ways that you can do it. Probably the easiest way is to right-click on the tree, right-click on it, and bring up the wiring view. Now, this can be a bit hard to read. And the reason it can be a bit hard to read is because it's hidden in the background. And this is a reverse view. So hang on, I need to do this from the front. And so string 1, pixel 1, is actually here on the left. You can also read it. If you come down here, it tells you that the starting location is bottom left. Okay, so that means the first pixel is going to be down here at the bottom of the left as you look at it from the front. Now, the problem is on this tree here, it's also going to say bottom left. And that's why it's important that you understand that our assumption is that bottom left would be here with the pixels coming around this way. So starting at the back and coming around the tree as you look down on it, counterclockwise. All right. Now you can do it the other way, and there's a number of options here. So if you choose bottom right, it's still going to start at the back of the tree, but now it's going to come around the tree in a clockwise direction when you look down from the top of the tree. So you can set the starting location, and obviously if you chose bottom right here, it would start here. Bottom right would start over here. Bottom left would start over here. It's that sort of thing. Okay, let's keep going. Most of these properties I don't really care about, but I do want to touch on the number of strings. So the number of strings, as this tooltip here suggests, should generally be thought of as the number of connections that I'm going to have which carry data from my controller to my tree. And so some people run, they'll have a 16 strand tree with 16 sets of pixels going to the top, and they'll connect each strand of pixels to a separate output on the controller. If that's true, then your number of strings is 16. But what if you only had 4 connections going back to your controller, and then you zigzagged it up and down so that the string went up and down 4 times? You would represent that differently. So instead of 16 here, you would say that's 4, because 4 times 4 is 16. And the 4, instead of being 50 long, these strings would be 200 long. And then the strands per string tells you about the zigzag. So in this case, it would zigzag up and down 4 times, so I would change that to 4. And so now you see a tree that looks exactly the same as the previous one. And it does. It looks exactly the same, but it is now wired differently. It's wired, and if I bring up the node layout here, you can see it. It kind of gives you that idea, right? So strand 1 starts here, and it goes up and down 4 times, ending with 200 at the bottom here. And then the second strand starts and goes up and down 4 times before strand 3 starts. Now, the thing to notice here is that if you choose to build your tree this way, notice how the first pixel of the strand always starts at the bottom or the top, depending on your start point. You can't start a strand of strings halfway up or halfway down. So if you're running a tree, and we more commonly see this in matrices, but let's say you decided your tree was going to be 55 pixels up and down. So you went up 55 and then you come down 55, but obviously you run out partway down. You can't just pick up another string here and run it back to the controller and use the tree model. Now you can definitely join multiple strings of lights together to make up 200. Everything's good. But it does assume that the start of each string is either at the bottom or the top of the tree. It also assumes that every string is the same length. Notice how, this one's 200, this one's 200, this one's 200, this one's 200. There is no current way in xLights for you to say that actually this last string here, I only want that to be 100. right? So you want to define a tree where the strings are, the number of strings divides evenly into the number of pixels on the tree, so that you end up with a model that is suitable in xLights. Now, if you do wire your tree in a way that is different to this, you will not be able to use the tree model. You will have to use one of the other model types to support it. Now, that's actually strictly speaking not true. You can use the tree model, but if you want to use some of the features like uploading to controllers and things like that, you're going to have to get into things like shadow models, and there are videos that are around on that. But just face facts, those sorts of things are introducing additional complexities that you probably don't want to be introducing unless you really, really have to. And so try to avoid it by building trees the way in which xLights expects them to be built, and you will have a lot less complexities and difficulties. So that's our round tree. We've done our half round. I don't need to change anything. You can do similar things with number of strings and strands per string, etc. here. I do want to turn this, however, into a spiral tree. And you do that up here using the spiral wraps. Now, typically a spiral tree, now this doesn't have to be one string, but generally speaking, they are one string. And then if I come up to spiral wraps here, let's set that to 5. It will wrap those pixels around in a 3D spiral around a single point. Now, I don't have to have just one string. If I want to have 2 strings of lights, I can have 2 strings of lights, but understand that they will both start from the bottom. And because I've set 2 strings, obviously this is assuming 2 connections back to the controller. Now, I can also define 1 string and 2 strands per string, and that assumes, I have to make it 100, otherwise it changes appearance. That assumes that you're going to spiral up to the top and then spiral back down to the bottom again. So that's how you would create spiral trees. Now, the other thing that some people like to do is actually use these things around columns. So we change that back to 1. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I didn't mean that. If we change strings back to 1, and sorry, that back to 1. If you were wrapping these pixels around a column, you can play with the bottom to top ratio here and set that to 1, at which point you actually end up with a spiral that's like a cylinder. And you can do the same thing with a 360-degree tree. You can set the bottom to top ratio to 1, and now you've got an up-down column wrapper as well. So you can use the tree model to model those sorts of props as well. What does rotation do in a tree? Stay away from rotation. The problem with rotation, and this is true on all props, many props here have rotation. The problem with rotation is it rotates it here on the view, and when you use that model in a group, everything will work as expected. But when you drop effects onto the actual prop, it won't work as you expect. Is there a spiral tree prop, or do I need to buy one? People just use things like tomato cages and the like. And just that's what these are. These are actually spiral trees down the left here, and they are just tomato cages with 36 pixels, I think, wrapped around each one of them. All right, so that's the tree model. The matrix model is very similar to the tree model in the types of mistakes that people make and the types of settings here. Again, you have the ability to say which direction the pixels are wired. So horizontal assumes that you're going across and back the model, whereas vertical assumes you're going up and down the model. Here you have the same sorts of locations that you're starting from, bottom left, top right, etc., wherever your first data wire comes in. You also have your number of strings, which is the number of connections back to your controller. Again, you want to set this appropriate. It's much more common for people, particularly because when you buy things like the mesh that the vendors sell, they're typically 48 pixels across, and because people are buying strings of 50 or 100, and so they end up with extra pixels, and so some people like to put those extra pixels just here and then start the next string afterwards. Again, you will run into issues if you do that, because it won't map to the actual model layout here. So you want to consider that carefully before you build things that way. This is also how you do P panels and the like. If you're doing P5, P10 panels, or even virtual matrices, you'll want to set that starting location to top left. The number of strings should be the number of rows, and the nodes per string should be the number of columns on those P panels. Whereas if you're doing a pixel matrix, obviously you would tend to zigzag the pixels backwards and forwards, and you would set the appropriate properties. For some matrices, particularly really dense matrices like a virtual matrix, etc., you may want to come down and play with some of the string properties. Appearance properties. And you may want to change the pixel style. Now, by default, they're always smooth. You may want to change them to square. That just draws the pixels as little squares, and you'll find that visually that might look a little bit more appealing if you go that way. So that's that one. Arches are pretty straightforward. Again, as with all the models, they support multiple different styles. With arches, you can represent multiple arches. So you can say this is actually 3 arches, which just assumes that you're now chaining those 3 arches together. Or you can just do 1. You can also layer the arches, which assumes, set it to 3. And then I just need to set the layer sizes, so I can say that this is actually 3 layers of 50 arches each. Okay, there we go. So now I've got arches that are basically nested inside one another. And the wiring pattern again would be zigzagged. Again, you can see that by right-clicking and choosing the wiring view, and you can see here how it assumes that the pixels are going to be wired from the inside out and zigzag around. That's the sort of thing. Now you can also change the starting location. Here it's starting with the green square, so it's starting here on the left hand side. It actually starts on the inside, but it's on the left hand side, or the blue square, which would then start it over here on the inside on the right hand side. Notice that when you click on wiring view, the wiring view is always by default the reverse view. And the reason for that is the most common use of the wiring view is for people that are pushing pixels into the back of Coro. And because you tend to push the pixels in from the back, having the reverse view makes a lot of sense. If you want to change it to the front view, you just have to right click and change it to the front view. Wouldn't the bottom middle arches have less lights? Maybe they do. And again, you can change that. You can set in here and say that actually the middle layer is 20 lights and 30 lights and so forth. You can do that. That's up to you. Don't forget though to at the end change the total to match the overall total. So this would now be 100. You want to get that right. With arches, you can also tilt them. And so if I was doing my arches over here, I would draw a line out like so. I would change the number of arches to 3, and then I would grab this and bring it up and tilt it to represent things the way it's actually laid. AC arches, that's actually a really good question. How do I do AC arches? So what if this was a segment of 8 segments of AC arches? How would I represent that? And that's actually not that hard to do either. There's a couple of things that you need to change though to make that possible. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to come down to the string properties and change the string property. Now, by default, always, whenever you drop a prop down, it will assume it's a pixel. And that's because xLights is most commonly used for pixels. But you can come down here and change this to be a single color and choose the color of those LEDs. By default, I would generally choose white unless I have a reason to choose something else. And now that arch has been defined here, if I expand this out, so I've currently defined that to be 50 pixels. So this is assuming this is a 50 segment AC arch. Now I can obviously change that to be 8, and now it's an 8 segment arch. It's kind of hard to see it down there. So now it's 8 segments. Now, of course, you would typically have a whole bunch of LEDs in each segment. And so I can do that by changing the lights per node here and set that, I don't know, to 20 or something. And so now this is a 8 segment arch with 20 lights per segment. And as you can see here, it uses channels 106.651 to 106.658, which happens to be 8 channels. So each channel will control 20 LED lights. And so that's how you would create an AC arch, which is commonly used, particularly in lighter armor and the like. People have often built those sort of old school arches, and that's how you do that. And to be honest, you do a similar thing with the tree here. So this 360 tree, if these were dumb strings of lights, I would do a similar sort of thing. I would come down here, change the string type to single color. In this case, I don't know, let's imagine they're red. I could change them to red, and now because it's currently set at 16 strings, this is using up 16 channels, 2401 to 2416, 16 strings of red LEDs. Can I integrate both AC and pixel? In the same display, absolutely. You set these properties on a per prop basis. So yes, you can do it. You can also build super strings here. So I can come in here, instead of saying it's a single color, I can say it's a super string. And then I can come down and say, well, it's a super string of 3 colors. Those 3 colors are red, green, and let's change that to white. And so now it's going to use 3 channels per strand, and obviously those strands are going to support red, green, and white.
Question.
Yeah.
That arch that you just made, wouldn't you change the thing from WS 2011, change that to a DMX?
So these controller connection properties down here are set when you're configuring the controller. And because we're not configuring the controller yet, you can totally ignore these properties. And in fact, if you don't actually use xLights to configure your controller, you don't need to set these controller connection properties at all. They have no impact on xLights itself. They only have an impact on your controller when you do an upload to it. And that's why I didn't fuss with them, because they're not relevant at this point. And in fact, if I never upload to the controller, I can leave this as WS2811 and it will have no impact at all on how xLights sequences that arch.
I had a question about, does xLights support 3D grids?
It does, and I'll jump very briefly into 3D. So this is 3D mode. So now you can see my 3D trees are actually in 3D. The cube model here, which we drew earlier, is a 3D grid of pixels. Is that what you're looking for?
Yes, thanks.
Yep.
With those super strings, is that mainly talking about AC?
Yes.
Like
So a super string would be basically what people used to do was they used to take a string of red lights, a string of green lights, a string of white lights, a string of purple lights, whatever it happens to be, and then they would twist them all together. And they treat them as a single string of lights, but obviously with 3 different colored LEDs in them. Perfect. So it's a really old school way of doing Christmas lights, but obviously it provided support for multiple colors before we had pixels. And still quite popular. A number of people still use that as a way in which they build their trees or their arches, etc. I mean, I can use so same super strings on here, on this arch, if I wanted to. Instead of having just white lights for each segment, I could put a super string in each segment, in which case it would use 4 channels or 3 channels per segment for each of the different color lights.
Do you worry about scale at all as far as bringing in the photo of your house to the scale of the tree? So,
I do. So when I do my layout, everything is overlaid approximately or as close as I can get. And that's one of the reasons why I use a photo of my house with the lights on it, because it lets me actually get things exactly where they are from this perfect viewing point. And I used to spray paint a dot onto the road so I knew where I'd taken my photo from too. And that was the perfect place to watch the lights.
Okay, so it's just done visually, not setting a scale on your picture to and having it work off of scales or anything like that. It's more just visually that you draw your tree into the right height compared to your
Exactly.
house.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, look, if I was doing 3D, I mean, obviously, once you start to do 3D, things become a little bit different because then you're trying, now you've got something that's actually got proper dimensions. Here, the house, of course, looks small because it's a good 60 to 80 feet away from where I'm standing. Whereas in 3D, everything's got the proper dimensions. You've got a ruler in 3D where you can measure your tree and set its height exactly. All that sort of stuff is possible. When you're doing 2D, you're not that worried about that. You're more looking at, from this particular point, where is each pixel? Can I get it roughly right so that when I do a sweep or I do a spinner on the house, the pixels all light up correctly as you would expect from this viewing point, but only from this viewing point.
I have a quick question. This is Chris. If I'm doing a mesh matrix and it's 65 nodes from the bottom of my column to the top of my column, I don't want to use a 50 node strand. I want to use 100 and cut it at 65, not attached right after 50. Is that what you were saying earlier?
So if you were doing something like this, you mean?
Yes.
Right. And so if you want to do this, so you're going to go all the way around. What you're saying is how many strings are you going to do? Let's say, I don't know, 16. And you want it 65 and one strand per string. So that would assume that you're using 16 connections to the controller. It's 65 pixels going from bottom to top, and that at the top it stops. And then the next string starts with another connection back to the controller. That's how that's defined.
So I would just cut 100 strands
100.
to 65 versus
That's right.
connecting at 50 and
Yeah.
continuing it down.
Yeah, you cut it at 65 and just chop it off, or you could leave it hanging loose. It really doesn't matter. It's only going to control the first 65 on each strand. Now, what most people would do, of course, they would zigzag it down again, because most controllers these days, even the older controllers can run a minimum of 340 pixels per output, and some controllers these days will run well over 1200. Now, there's downsides to that, of course, as well. But like I said, there are trade-offs to be had, and everything is a trade-off. And anyone who has a mantra that says this is good and this is bad, is really not someone you want to be listening to. You want to be listening to people that can talk you through the pros and cons and the advantages and disadvantages of particular ways in which you might set things up, and then play to your strengths and constraints. I know lots of people that would run this as 16 connections to the controller just because they don't like doing power injection. They find all of that stuff really complex and risky, and so they don't mind spending a little bit more buying a few more controllers because this is easy for them to set up and they like it. Whereas I know other people that would try and run this whole thing off a single port, and they'd be doing power injection all over the place because they're comfortable doing it, and at the end of the day for them it's all about maximizing the utilization of their controller. Neither of them are wrong. They're just optimizing for different situations.
Yeah, on your super strings, could you turn two colors on at the same time, or do you have to stack mini trees together to get that function?
So there are some constraints and some benefits of super strings, and I made a video on it that was published, I think last year sometime, maybe last year or the year before, where I talked through the pros and cons of them and how you can control individual colors if you aren't happy with the way the behavior is by default. And I would strongly encourage you to go and watch that video because it will explain to you and show you those techniques, which I don't really want to dive into right now.
Thank you.
Yep. Another reason to subscribe to my YouTube channel. All right, let's quickly touch on our image model. We talked about it previously. So the image model basically is a single channel model that just turns on or off according to the value that you put on it, the brightness that you set it to. And the way in which you set an image is actually down here in the properties. There is an image property, and you can go in and choose an arbitrary JPEG file for that. Here I've gone and made my house the JPEG. And so that image will change in brightness according to the value of the channel So typically you'd put a snowman or a Santa Claus or a reindeer or something in there that represents your blow up. Yeah, take a picture of it and put it in there. That's the image model. I don't want to do all of these. I do want to touch briefly maybe on the single line. The key thing with the single line is to remember, the starting location and ending location. So you do want to take advantage of that. Other than that, the single line's pretty straightforward. The polyline we talked about. So if I've got a single, and I do, so my polyline actually runs from here to here to here to here to here to here to here and all the way down to here. So that's actually one string of lights on my house. Now you'll notice that it's spread them out, and there's actually, if I move this a little bit off so you can see it, there's actually relatively few pixels there. What you can do with the polyline is you can come in and click on this individual segments, and here I get to define how many lights are in each segment. So if this last segment up here had, I don't know, 80 lights in it, I can come down here to the last segment and set 80 lights, and it will now show me 80 lights in that segment. The other thing that you can do with this is, and I'll do this a little bit differently, I'll do this up here. Let's imagine I was doing my garage doors. Well, you'll notice that when I do my garage doors, I've got this little bit at the bottom where there's actually no pixels, yet the Polyline model insists on drawing these pixels down here. Well, what you can do is I can come in, define individual segments here, and scroll down and say, well, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 should be 0, and so I can set that to 0, and it will draw me a segment with no pixels. And so no matter how far apart I put them, it won't put any pixels in that section. So a polyline doesn't have to be a continuous run of pixels. You can have gaps. And in fact, I've seen people actually build custom model type props using the polyline model definition. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but you can do it. Yeah.
I have a question. Yeah. How do you handle areas in your house like that's not visible from the angle where you took the picture of, like looking at your house?
Yep. Yeah, so the question's actually quite common. So let's imagine instead that I'd done a front-on picture of this house rather than slightly on an angle like my house is, and this string of pixels here was not visible. It was all hidden down the side of the house as looking like a single pixel. If you stick with 2D and you decide not to go to 3D, what people would commonly do is, they draw a line across the front of the house to represent that piece, and then they'll come to the side and they go, oh, I can't really draw that because it goes back into the screen. And so commonly people would do things like draw up at 45 degrees the missing pixels. And it looks weird on the layout here, but when you sequence it, it actually works quite well. Of course, what other people would do is at that point they'd go to 3D and they'd do a polyline that went back into the screen, and then they would sequence things that way. So you can do either way. So that's Polyline. I did show you how to do an arc on the Polyline by clicking on a segment and right-clicking and defining a curve. If you want to add an extra point, you can also do that by right-clicking on a segment, and it will throw a point into the middle, and you can then add a point in. You can also click on a point and delete it, so you can edit it pretty well. The other thing you can do, and my screen's getting very cluttered here. Let's delete some things. Delete all of those. The other thing that you can do is you can use a polyline to actually represent icicles. So I've got icicles that run from here, to there and to there. So I've drawn a polyline in there right now. And if I wanted to represent that as icicles, I can actually do that as well. And I would do that by using the drop pattern here. At the moment it's set to 1, but let's imagine it was a 3, 4, 5 icicle. I could represent the icicles this way, and it's still a polyline, right? It's still separately pivots at the corner of my house there. Obviously, I would need to increase the number of pixels pretty substantially because icicles use a lot more pixels. But yeah, you can do your icicles using your Polyline. You can also do pixel stakes. So I've got some pixel stakes that run down my driveway here, and so let's imagine it was going around my garden and I had a line of pixel stakes like this, and I can come into here and define a curve and maybe have it bend around nicely. So there it is. That's the edge of my driveway, imagine. And then I can come down to here to my drop patterns, and let's imagine these are 10 high pixel stakes. Well, if I type -10 into here and then obviously substantially increase the number of pixels, these are now pixel stakes. They're 10 high and there's 60 of them, and they follow a nice curve. And if you do the node layout, you will see that they start down at the bottom and go to the top, and then down to the bottom and up to the top. And of course, that's not how I would wire them. There is also the alternate drop nodes, which I can click on, and that will change the wiring layout again. So now it starts at node 1 here on the first one, and instead of going to the second one, it jumps over the second one and goes to the third one, and then to the 5th, and then the 7th, and then the 9th, up to the 10th, back down to the 8th, the 6th, the 4th, and the 2nd. So I'm back at the bottom, ready to go to my second pixel stake. And so now I've got alternately node wired pixel stakes in a polyline, in a curve around my garden using the Polyline model. Right, so there's some enormous flexibility in these models to support the sorts of things that people do. I'm going to skip over a few more things here. The star model, the thing to understand about the star model is that you do have support for layers. So you can say that this is actually a 3-layer star, and here you can go and say that the inside, maybe the inside's only 20, 30, and 50, and so it sets a layered star with different numbers of nodes per layer. Probably doesn't stand out as much as it should do, but take it from me, there's a 3-layered star in there with different number of nodes per star. So rather than using a custom model for the star, the inbuilt star allows you to build it. You can of course do the same thing in a custom model as well. Touching quickly on the window frame, just so you can show you how to do a door. That's as simple as down here. You can set the number of lights at the bottom to be 0, and that window frame now becomes a door. Obviously, you want to choose where it starts from. At the moment, it's bottom left and it's going clockwise, so it's going to start down here and go around. You could, of course, change it to bottom right, in which case you'd probably want it counterclockwise, and you could wire it the other way. So both things. Again, node layout will show you where that node pixel 1 is down there on the bottom right, and how it goes around counterclockwise. So this is how you build your display up and lay your pixels out. And this is where I would start. Don't worry about things like start channels and stuff like that at this point. You just want to be building all the props for your display and laying things out accordingly.
So a quick question. On the polylines, I tried to use them along the driveway, and I wanted to have different segments that I could program separately. I was wondering, is there a way to align those nodes so that I get a straight line along that driveway? You have nodes in the center and you've got 8 segments, right? 8 strings basically.
Yeah.
Or strands. Is there a way, so like if you accidentally get those nodes off so they're not in a straight line, can you somehow align those so that they'll be in a straight line from the first node to the last node, so that each of the segments is a straight line, but you've got the ability to have different segments along that line?
So you mean if I come here and if I click this segment and add a point and I get this out of whack and I want to bring it back into line, is that what you mean?
Right. So all the points are in a straight line instead of, out of sync or whatever. or curved or?
Yeah, there's no tool that guarantees that, obviously, other than deleting the point and clicking on it again and re-adding it. At that point, it's definitely in a straight line, but there's no tool for getting it back and aligning that point in line between the previous point and the post point. There's no tool that does that. Now, hypothetically, if you wanted to do the math, you could come down here and work it out using the formula for working out what a straight line intersection point would be. You could do that and calculate what those points are, but no, not by default. So before we move any further, what I do want to do is I want to highlight things like submodels and the like. So submodels are a way in which you can take a model, and let's take this model here, which is pretty ugly, but let's imagine that, oh, that's why, this is a spurious pixel there. Let's imagine I wanted to create a submodel that represented all the verticals of this particular model here, so that I could sequence something that bounced up and down maybe along the verticals but didn't touch on the pixels that are across the top here. And the way we do that is with a thing called a submodel. And so when you click on the model properties, every model has a submodel down here. And when you click on that, you get the submodel dialog. And the submodel dialog lets you go and create multiple submodels associated with a model. And the way you do that is you add it here, and let's call this verticals. And now we can go and we can add in each pixel. Now you can do this a couple of different ways. I can add a bunch of rows here, and you can't see it because this thing's so faint, I can barely see it. But I could go in here and I can click and drag thanks to some changes that Scott made, and I can highlight each row here and put the pixels in that represent that submodel. And so I'm just highlighting, I need one more row of pixels. And now it's created a submodel which just represents the vertical portions of that model. And so when I click over here and I come in here and click on this verticals, you can see that it's only highlighting the vertical components of the model because that's what that submodel now represents. So when if I sequence on that verticals, it will only light up the pixels that are in the vertical sections of that particular model and will always ignore the top pixels. And I can reorder those pixels, I can create different structures, and I'm not going to go into all those details. There's a video that I made September 2019 which talked through buffers and layers, etc. And if you really want to understand how these things get sequenced and how different layouts changes the way effects looks, you should really go and take a look at that video to understand those details.
Keith, I've got a question on that.
Yeah.
I actually went the opposite way and put single lines, like for instance on my garage, I put single lines on the left, top, and right. Did I put myself in a corner doing it that way, or
no, not
or is
at
that
all.
just another way of doing it?
Not at all. It just means obviously it's actually even easier when you want to create the verticals, because you'll create a group and you'll put the vertical strings in and leave out the horizontals, and it will be all good. The only slight disadvantage with that is obviously when you're editing it, you've got to eyeball putting everything in the right place. But there's actually nothing wrong with it. It just means you just need to chain everything up correctly. There are many ways to do things in xLights, right? I've shown you multiple ways to do icicles, multiple ways to do house lines, etc. And that's deliberate. And sometimes one is better than another in certain circumstances, but sometimes it's a push. You could go either way, and it doesn't really make any difference. Right? You do what you prefer. Let's talk about custom models quickly, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly download, because it's easier just to download a custom model. Let's pick something, I don't know, a Boscoyo penguin. There we go. Wow, it's got big pixels on him. I'm not sure why they chose to do that. Now, xLights does not control these models. These models are provided by the vendor. If you don't like the way they look, you need to speak to the vendor. So let's maybe not make it 2, let's make it 5, a little bit bigger so you can see him. So when you bring a custom model in, so there's a few things I want to show you about custom models. The first one is the actual data itself. So you access the layout of the pixels using the model data here, which brings up this spreadsheet. You can zoom in and zoom out using the buttons here. And you can see that you can barely see, but there are basically numbers inside these cells which represent the numbers of each pixel, and this is the model down below. So you can see it. You can actually turn on the wiring here, and you can see how they've chosen to wire it. And he's got a jump here that runs from here all the way up to here, which means you're going to have to cut and splice your pixels or run 2 strings of pixels to wire this thing together. You can see the starting point is down here in the bottom left, and if I click on a pixel up here, it highlights it in pink, so you can see where that pixel actually is and orientate yourself. Now, if you want to change these numbers, if you want to reverse these 2 pixels around, you can do so by changing the numbers. You can also manually build these things. So someone at some point has come in and either use this tool, or there's a tool on David Peace's site called Lightshow Hub, I think his website is, where he's got a tool which offers a slightly different spin on how to create custom models, and some people will find that easier, particularly for certain types of models. There's also a tool inside the menu here called generate custom model, and that actually will run you through a process where you video the prop and then you play the video back into xLights, and xLights will actually work out where all the pixels are, and I know people have used that to map the pixels on props with hundreds and hundreds of pixels, and it does it pretty accurately. It can be a little fiddly to use. Jeff at Canispata Christmas, he made a video on this last year sometime, where he went through all the 3 different ways in which you can build a custom prop. He showed how to use the xLights grid that we were just in. He went through how to use a video, and he also went through the Lightshow Hub tool and showed how to use that tool to generate a custom model. And look, they all have their pros and cons for different types of video props that you might be building. The other beauty of downloading a prop like this is they come predefined typically with things like submodels. And so you can see that the vendor here has taken the time to create submodels for the eyeballs and the belly and the wings, etc., so that when it comes time for you to be sequencing it, you don't have to go and do that yourself. It will save you a bunch of time. Let's see how, no, they haven't defined any states. That's a pity. This model could really do with some states. This is also a singing face type prop as well. So there's probably a face definition in here for this prop. And there is. So faces are something, and again, there is a bunch of videos on faces. I'm not going to do a whole bunch of singing faces here, but the face definitions are a way in which you can define which pixels to light up when certain phonemes, and these are the different phonemes, the different mouth shapes that are used, will light up. And I would question whether these are actually good, because they don't look good to me. That's not what I would have expected to light up. This one's a bit better. Okay, this mouth definition's a bit better. I'm not sure why they didn't remove the other one. But you can show how they've decided which pixels to light up for with which mouth shapes. And this makes sequencing singing faces really, really easy, because once you've done this once, when it comes time to actually make the model sing, you just have to set up the lyric tracks, etc. And we'll go through that to make that work. So that's the benefit of downloading props from suppliers, they often include all of those definitions pre-done for you, and you'll occasionally see people who get quite frustrated when they download a prop and it doesn't have all the things that they were hoping it might have, and then people go fishing around for them.
Would this be a good time to plug the Google Drive with those resources and models as well?
So, okay, so there is a Google Drive which you can access here, I think. Yeah, I think it's in resources. If you come up to the xlights.org page, go to the resources, you come down, there's a community models, a Google Drive. So the Google Drive is a community resource. Please be careful with it. It's easy for people to muck this thing up, so please be careful when you're on here. But basically it has things like a folder here for models, where people have uploaded models from a variety of different suppliers, and you can go in and download their models. Now, sometimes people will take the model that they downloaded from the Boscoyo site and maybe fix up some problems with it, or add some submodels or things like that. And you can then access them from the Google Drive. Your mileage will vary. Sometimes there's quality, sometimes there's as much rubbish in here as any other location that you might choose to go and download things. There are other things in this Google Drive, including sequences and effects and all sorts of things. So, if you haven't taken a browse through here, this is the common community dumping ground for things that people want to share. And if you haven't noticed yet, the xLights community is pretty prolific at sharing things and encouraging others to build on the things that they've done. So yeah, thank you.
Do you have any thoughts on how to do a custom model of a mega snowman?
Why would it be any different to any other snowman? Is it a 3D model or 2D or?
No, like a mega 360 degree snowman, 16 feet tall, like a mega tree, only a snowman, using 3 large spheres. I just didn't know if there were any models out there, or if you had any suggestions.
I doubt there are models out there. I can think of ways that you can do things, and I'll quickly jump into 3D in a minute, and I'll show you some things in 3D that you might want to take advantage of. But at the end of the day, complex models like that, particularly 3D models, are hard work, and there are no shortcuts to doing 3D models. There is the ability to do it in xLights, and the Lightshow Hub also has something that attempts to make 3D possible, but none of the things make things super easy. You can export things like the sphere model to custom models and then copy and paste things around, but it's work. It's not something that's not going to take a lot of time, and it's not something that's going to be easy to do. It's going to take you time.
It actually seems like you could model it as a tree almost.
Well, you could do. If you don't mind that it looks like a tree, there's nothing to stop you doing it like a tree. And like I said, people do their 3D stars using the sphere model. It doesn't look anything like a 3D star, but at the end of the day, the pixels are essentially laid out the same way. It's just, there's some XY coordinates that are slightly different.
In this case, would you, if we just talk about the base circle here, would you do it like that model you have in the upper left, where that would, the one that you've already created?
You could do that, or you could take the sphere model here, right, and set the appropriate number of pixels, and you can actually export the sphere model as a custom model. So we'll save that, and then what we'll do is we'll import it back in again. Right, so this is actually a custom model of a sphere. And what I mean by that, it looks like the sphere model, but it's actually a custom model, which means that I can actually now edit the model data. And when you edit the model data here, right, so the first thing to understand is it's still a 3D model. Right, so when I spin it around, it looks like a 3D model. And you can see that it's actually represented as a series of layers. So I can cut vertical slices through, and you can see where each pixel is in 3D space. Now, there's no reason why you couldn't make this now twice as large and then paste and you'd have to do it layer by layer, but paste another circle above it. Doable. You'd probably then want to renumber everything. Again, a lot of work, but doable. All right. And you could actually build out using largely xLights generated 3D models to build that snowman. So it's doable. It's not trivial, and it will take a lot of time, and I'm not going to obviously get into that right now. Let's talk briefly about 3D, because some of you will choose to go 3D. I'm not going to spend an enormous amount of time on it. There are a bunch of videos out there that various people have made showing how to set up 3D. It is a very, very, very time-consuming process to get it set up in the first place, but once it's set up, it's actually pretty easy to use. So here we are in 3D. If you get yourself all lost in space, right click and click reset, and it will bring you back to where you should be. With 3D, you can equally start with your house if you wanted to, but you wouldn't use the house here. You would actually need to come into this add object and add an image, and with the image model you would then choose your image, which in this case would be my house, and it will bring my house in. Obviously I'm going to want to move it up. Now in 3D, the positioning etc is controlled by these sort of 3-axis type things, and so if I want to bring this thing up in space, I have to zoom in and find that thing and bring it up. Of course, most people that are doing 3D won't use just an image of their house. They'll actually want a 3D model of their house. There are services out there that will generate you the OBJ file. There's an app called Hover. Look, it changes over time as to whether these things are free or not. Some things require you to sign up, and you're doing a trial period, and because you're really only converting one house, you can get your whole thing done within the trial period and then shut your trial down, and you don't end up actually having to pay any money. So lots of people take advantage of those things. There are various post streams on Facebook. If you go and search in there for, Hover and 3D and things like that, you'll find a whole bunch of posts that talk about how people went about getting their house into xLights and getting their OBJ file. Mine, and if I can do this without taking too long, because I didn't actually set this up, let's add in a mesh. So the mesh, you add in a mesh, you get that box. You come down to here, you choose your OBJ file. So if I go into here, here's my house file, and there it is. Now you can see the scale of my house is stupid small, and it's also rotated pretty badly compared to the default view here. So I need to play with that. And to do that, to be honest, the easiest way to do that is to come down here and type properties in. So set it to 4, set the scale to 4 on all 3 dimensions, and then I think it's rotate Y. It is. And 130 went a bit too far, maybe 110. Not quite. And so that's how I can now bring my house in. It's facing the right direction, etc., and I can proceed to lay things out. Now what people will commonly do is they will add an image, they'll rotate the image so it's flat, and then they'll take something like a Google view of their house from over the above, lay out their lawn, and then they can put all their props at the appropriate place relevant to their actual house, and by scaling it appropriately so it overlays perfectly with their house, you can actually get a pretty good representation. Now there is also on here a thing called a ruler, which you can come in and drag Where's my ruler? There's my ruler. Let's bring my ruler out. Why is my ruler playing up on me? Out, mesh. All right, there's my ruler. There we go. All right, let's bring our ruler out. now we can go back to our house and bring him back. All right, there's my pink ruler. So what I can do with my ruler is I can bring him in and put him up against something in my house that I actually understand the dimensions of. And this is really fiddly. Don't get me wrong, this is really fiddly. When you think you've got everything lined up perfectly and then you rotate it and you realize that actually I'm not up against my garage, I'm still several feet in front of my garage. This gets really fiddly really quickly. Where are we? Why is that yellow? Come on. And so you can move this back, and if I line that up perfectly with my garage door, and I know that my garage door is a certain width, etc., I can come in here and I can say that's actually 2.4 meters wide, and it will now have a set of dimensions. So when I come and throw a tree down here in my front yard, and I look down here, it will tell me that I've just drawn a tree that is 83. What did I do? Hang on, objects. It's 2.9 meters, whoops. Oh, width, height, 2.29 meters. So that is 2.29 meters high. So I can play with that, resize that tree, and if you look down in the bottom left, you can see that it's actually showing me the height of that tree in real world dimensions, which I can now change. Also in 3D, take advantage of things like control keys and shift keys and the like, because different modifier keys allow you to do things like here I'm changing the size of all 3 dimensions at once by holding the control key down and clicking on one of these boxes. There's also a right-click menu here to do things like align the tree with the ground and make sure that the tree starts on the ground and things like that. And as at this release here, Gil's also added a terrain object. So instead of having this grid line or this mesh, you can add a terrain object, which actually allows you to take this grid and map it out in 3D as well. So if your house falls away from the street or is above the street and you'd like to actually represent the terrain and the fall, etc., you can now do so using that terrain object as well for those people that want to go that extra mile. This is one of these things that you can invest a huge amount of time in. It's questionable about, does it generate a better show or not? Look, some people will say absolutely, and for some layouts, I'd say they're probably right. For other layouts, it's largely neither here nor there, and so I would encourage you to think carefully about, do I really want to invest all the time in getting my house layout set up perfectly, or do I just want to just accept the default and go with that? The only other thing in 3D is you can also save camera positions. So I can rotate the camera to be above, and I can save the current viewpoint, and I can call that above. And you will actually be able to use that when it comes time to sequence, and you'll be able to sequence from above. So if you were to drop something like a pinwheel and have the light sort of spin around, you can have it spin around as if it was viewed from the top rather than from the front of your house. And that is something that is uniquely capable if you go 3D. So it works really great if you've got a lot of depth to your property and you want the lights to sweep away from the viewer or sweep to the viewer. That sort of viewpoint and the ability to use that sort of thing can really generate some really interesting effects that would actually be quite hard to achieve otherwise.
Yeah, I have a question. I missed out that part. How do we move the 3D model in the plane? Because when I was trying to do that, every time I was trying to move the object, the plane itself was rotating.
Okay, so to do that, first of all, you need to choose the tab, right? So when you're choosing the Models tab, you can select Models, but you can't select the objects. When you're in the Objects tab, you can select the objects, but you can't select the models. So the first thing you want to be is you want to be in the Models tab. So now we've selected the Mesh object. The next thing that I would do is I would turn it to Mesh only. And what that does is it hides all of that things and allows me to see the resizing controls in here. And at this point, I can now easily move my mesh around or resize it or anything else. That is really hard to do when the properties are in place. So when it's not mesh only, I can't see those arrows. If I go under here, I can see the X and Y, sorry, the X and Z, but I can't see the Y and get to it easily. But if I go to mesh only, I can now see it, and it's easy to zoom in and move that around.
I have one quick question about the 3D before you completely leave that.
Yeah.
When you, or if you resize, say your house model after doing the laying out the ruler and measuring things, are the models content aware so that they'll know to make the? Okay, so if you were to resize something, you would have to resize everything individually.
If you resize your key element, that's right. I mean, you can if you resize the ruler, then obviously all the dimensions will appropriately change. But if you resize your house layout, then not all your other models will go with it. You're just resizing your house layout, and now you have to go and very laboriously go and reset everything else.
Right. So even if you were to resize the ruler, the models would still stay the same size. They just report as a much bigger model.
Yeah.
So like the Megatree would end up being.
If you change the ruler, that's right. So the ruler, changing the ruler does not change all the models. It just changes the ruler, and therefore it reads every model as being much bigger.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right. So a couple other things. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to very quickly throw some things down here, and then we're going to go and oh. Did that wrong. With a tree, you always... what are we doing? All right, let's get our trees in. So there's one. You can copy and paste. Control C, Control V will paste the trees in place. It's pretty easy. Let's quickly do house outline here. I'm not going to fuss about the number of pixels, close enough. Now you're doing your house layout will take some time to do and get it right. Having done this a few times, it's not that difficult for me. If I want to do my flat tree, now my flat tree is four strings of 600 pixels with 4 strands per string. So I can throw that in like that. You can see that it doesn't line up perfectly, and that's because obviously we're drawing 2D here rather than 3D, and that's okay. Now notice when I was trying to move my star, the damn polyline grabbed and it started to move. One of the things that you can do is you can lock models in place where all the handles go red, and now I can't accidentally move things. And so I would strongly suggest you want to go that way. Let's add 3 layers to my star. And 30. So that's all good. And let's throw an arch, or let's throw my arches back in. There's 50 per 3 arches. Oops. And put those arches in there. That'll do for now. Now these things here are actually one string of, I think it's 384, and it's 18 strands per string. I think that nicely divides into 19 from memory, and I'll just do one of them for now. All right, so that's good enough. You save your layout by clicking on the save here. When I click on the save here, it's actually saving my controller tab as well, because we set the link in the preferences right at the beginning of the presentation.